Hi everyone, this is Elaine. Welcome to Flat Earth for Dummies 101. Definition of dummy: indoctrinated in globe from birth. A spinning globe is only true in fairy tales. Only the truth will set you free. The lies were out to get me, to feast upon my brain. Free Masonic wormholes were to blame. Then I saw the way. Now I'm a flat earther. There is no curve, no globe in my mind. The earth is flat. We're the believers, don't eat the deceivers, those who lie.
In his 1881 and 1887 experiments, Albert Michelson discovered the Earth was not moving around the Sun. As Michelson himself described the results of his experiment, this conclusion directly contradicts the explanation, which presupposes that the Earth moves. But since his colleagues, including Albert Einstein, were die-hard Copernicans who didn't want to believe that Michelson had discovered a motionless Earth, they proposed his experimental apparatus was distorted by Earth's motion through space, and thus Michelson's apparatus only made it appear as if the Earth wasn't moving. In scientific parlance, we call this the fallacy of petitio principii, that is, using as proof a moving Earth, the very thing one is trying to prove, a moving Earth. Let me explain. The first light beam was pointed westward because it was the presumed direction of the Earth's movement around the Sun. The second light beam was pointed northward, and thus away from the direction of the presumed moving Earth. The first light beam should have been affected by Earth's movement through space if the Earth is moving around the Sun at an accepted speed of 66,000 miles per hour. If so, the first beam would have traveled slower than the second beam of light. But that didn't happen. Both light beams traveled at nearly the same speed. According to Michelson, the first beam traveled only about 1/6 of the speed needed if the Earth was moving around the Sun. The conclusion, as Michelson notes above, should have been that the Earth isn't moving around the Sun. Other prominent physicists have noted the same truth. There was just one alternative. The Earth's true velocity through space might happen to have been nil. Physicist Arthur Eddington. The data of the Michelson-Morley test were almost unbelievable. There was only one other possible conclusion to draw, that the Earth was at rest. On one hand, they could scrap the ether theory, which had explained so many things about electricity, magnetism, and light, or if they insisted on retaining the ether, they had to abandon the still more venerable Copernican theory that the Earth is in motion. To many physicists, it seemed almost easier to believe that the Earth stood still than that waves, light waves, electromagnetic waves, could exist without a medium to sustain them. It was a serious dilemma, and one that split scientific thought for a quarter of a century. Many new hypotheses were advanced and rejected. The experiment was tried again by Morley and by others with the same conclusion. The apparent velocity of the Earth through the ether was zero. Lincoln Barnett, foreword by Albert Einstein. What happened when the experiment was done in 1887? There was never in any orientation at any time of the year any shift in the interference pattern. None. No shift, no fringe shift, nothing. What's the implication? Here was an experiment that was done to measure the speed of the Earth's motion through the ether. This was an experiment that was 10 times more sensitive than it needed to be. It could have detected speeds as low as 2 miles per second instead of the known 20 miles per second that the Earth moves on its orbital motion around the Sun. It didn't detect it. What's the conclusion from the Michelson-Morley experiment? The implication is that the Earth is not moving. they searched for a way to make it appear that the first light beam did indeed provide sixth of the speed required for an Earth moving around the sun. To do so, they thought up an ingenious but devious explanation. As noted above, they claimed the Earth's movement around the sun contracted the metal enclosure in which the first light beam traveled. If the length of the housing was contracted, then the first light beam does not need to travel as far as when the housing is not contracted. This would account for why the speed of the two light beams did not differ much. With this contrived explanation, they proposed to the world that the contraction of Michelson's apparatus was the reason the Earth appeared to be motionless. In effect, if someone said to them, "You claim the Earth is moving, but you admit you cannot detect that movement by any experiment," they would retort, "Well, we can't detect it because every time we try to do so, the length of the experimental apparatus shrinks just enough to conceal the movement, which makes it impossible to measure the Earth's movement." Again, we see the fallacy of petitio principii in play. From start to finish, the whole enterprise was ad hoc. Length contraction wasn't even contemplated previously, much less was it an established fact of science. But in this emergency situation, length contraction was invented on the spot so that the science establishment would have at least some hypothetical answer as to why Michelson's experiment showed the Earth was motionless. Everyone could breathe a sigh of relief. The irony, as of this date, is that no one has ever detected a length contraction in a moving object. In fact, modern physicists can't even agree on what length contraction is or how it would be manifested. Since they insist the Earth is moving around the sun, yet cannot detect it moving, nevertheless, they needed some physical and mathematical way of accounting for it, since there's obviously a difference between motion and non-motion. So length contraction became their convenient scapegoat. This is the essence of the special relativity theory that Einstein invented in 1905. It was invented solely to answer Michelson's experiment, as Einstein himself said. To the question whether or not the motion of the Earth in space can be made perceptible in terrestrial experiments, we have already remarked that all attempts of this nature led to a negative result. Before the theory of relativity was put forward, it was difficult to become reconciled by this negative result. Whereas in 1892, Hendrik Lorentz had hypothesized that the ether of space was what caused the contraction, Einstein decided to dispense with ether and attribute the cause to relative motion. In effect, Lorentz at least proposed a physical cause for his claims of length contraction, but Einstein never explained how relative motion could shrink objects. Hence, during his day, various philosophers accused him of violating the principle of cause and effect. So whatever the cause of the contraction, in order to give the ad hoc theory some semblance of credibility, the required amount for the metal enclosure to contract was put into a mathematical equation called the Lorentz transform. It has become the most famous and most used equation in modern physics. Essentially, whatever tests disagree with their belief that the Earth was moving around the sun could now be mathematically transformed into their desired result, as well as give the semblance of being scientific. But the transform of length required another transform. Since they contracted the length, they also had to dilate the time, since if a moving object has its length contracted, it is not going to get from point A to point B in the same time as when it is not contracted. To increase the time of travel, they use the same transform equation as above, but since they are increasing instead of decreasing, they turn the multiplier into a divider to get the following equation. Of course, just as there is no proof that length contracts, there is no proof that time dilates. They just need it to make everything appear to balance if they are going to insist that the Earth is moving around the sun when the empirical evidence says that it's not. It's easy for them. They just put up a theory and represent it by a mathematical equation to erase any discrepancies the experiment shows against their theory. For those who accept the prima facie results of Michelson's experiment, that the Earth is not moving, The Earth is already shown to be an inertial frame because it is at an absolute rest. Thus, there is no need to create inertial frames for the Earth, and thus no need to use a transform equation. Since light moves so fast, it can serve to measure the effect on something as small as ether particles. His interferometer was so accurate it could measure 100 times more than it was required to measure. As such, Michelson's interferometer didn't measure enough ether to match an Earth moving at 66,000 miles per hour around the Sun, but it did measure a little ether. Otherwise, his results would not have shown 1/6, but 0/6 of ether presence. This was not good for Einstein. He candidly admitted that if any ether was detected, even a little bit, his theory of special relativity would automatically be falsified. This was noted in Einstein's statement to Sir Hubert Samuel in Jerusalem. If Michelson morally is wrong, then relativity is wrong. In other words, Einstein was forced to assume that because Michelson did not find enough ether for an Earth revolving around the Sun, then Michelson couldn't have found any ether. But if this conclusion of Einstein's was wrong, then his whole relativity theory would be falsified automatically, since even a little ether would act as an absolute frame and thus nullify relativity. Einstein was the Earth mover. He made the Earth move around the Sun and thus saved mankind from having to admit that popular science had misled the world for over 500 years. If one firmly believes the Earth is moving, but the experiments show it is not moving, then one's interpretation of the experiment will force one to find some way to make it appear that the Earth is moving. In effect, any experiment that shows the Earth is not moving will be magically transformed into a moving Earth by the transform equation. The transform equation is like a magician waving his wand over the experiments so that the system one does not prefer is transformed into a system one does prefer. All in all, the history of the Michelson experiment show how a preconceived idea, the Earth moves around the Sun, is made the sole determining factor of how modern scientist is going to interpret the results of any experiment. In order to hold on to his preconceived idea, he will introduce mitigating factors onto the experimental results, and usually this is done by hypothetical concepts and fudged mathematics. The scientist thus convinces himself that because he can invent a mathematical equation that can transform the empirical results, he can keep his preconceived idea of how he thinks the universe must operate. In his mind, the ends justify the means because he knows the Earth revolves around the Sun. There is nothing that would make mankind happier than to keep believing that the Earth moves around the Sun, regardless of what the experiments show. Their God from on high, Albert Einstein, showed them a magical way to avoid such a predicament, and the world has accepted Einstein as a god ever since. His transform equation has become the magic wand to turn a fixed Earth absolute universe into an Earth-wandering relative universe.
So let those who want to believe in lies believe them.
So they project the image around the ball, and that's how they came up with the globe.
You want answers? I think I'm entitled. You want answers? I want the truth! You can't handle the truth!
That's why it's so hard to convince you you've been fooled.
We're the believers, don't heed the deceivers, those who lie.